Welcome back. You're watching Sky News Tonight, and over the next half an hour, we're going to be answering some of your questions about the war in Ukraine and how the recent escalation may have changed the situation. I'm joined by the Defence and Security Analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, who will attempt to answer all your questions. Some great questions, aren't there, Michael? Let's take Marcus's to start with first of all. Marcus asks this: do you think Ukraine can win this war, and what will be a likely solution to bringing an end to the conflict? Well, in terms of what's happening on the ground, we've seen these gains over the last few weeks and months by Ukraine.
Yes, it's plausible now that Ukraine can, I wouldn't use the phrase win the war, they can prevail militarily, which is to say they are capable of pushing the Russians back to where they were before the 24th of February in terms of the territorial gains, maybe going further. The Ukrainians certainly say they're going to keep on going until they get all of their territory back, going to 2014, which would include Crimea. Well, we'll see about that. But yes, can they do it? Yes. Will they do it? I don't know. But they are capable of doing it. But that is only this part of the struggle. This is the second war, right? The first war was 2014, the first Russian-Ukrainian war. This is the second Russian-Ukrainian war. My feeling is that there will be, maybe next year, a ceasefire, in which the Ukrainians will be better placed than we used to think. And that ceasefire will be unstable, it'll break down, there'll be a third war, and then a ceasefire and a fourth war. We're dealing here with an existential struggle because not just Putin, the Russian establishment thinks that Ukraine has no right to exist. And they'll go on
thinking. And it won't change that mindset.
They won't change in the short term. So this is likely to be a generational struggle. So let's say it's going to last 30, 40, 50 years.
Wow. So the second part of Marcus's question, what's a likely solution to bringing an end to the conflict? You're saying it's going to be a forever conflict.
Well, it's a forever conflict until something changes in European security or Russia, fairly fundamentally. But can the Ukrainians win back their territory? Yes, but they'll have to live in an armed peace with a neighbour 10 times their size that doesn't bear them any goodwill. And if there is a third war, it'll be probably tougher than this second war, because by then both of them will have armed themselves up. So this is the beginning of a completely new era in European security.
Well, we've got some questions later on, I know, from people asking about that change, potential change you mentioned there might happen in Russia. But let's take Rick's question next. Rick asks this: we've heard a lot about deficiencies in the Russian logistics, including fuel. Once the ground has frozen hard again, how successful do you think Ukrainian forces will be in further counterattacks during the winter period? As the saying goes, winter is coming.
Yes, and the Russians are clearly playing for time now because they're losing on two major fronts and may start to lose on a third front as well, south of Zaporizhia. I'm not sure about that, but that's possible. They're playing for time, waiting for the winter. Because in the winter, it's not that fighting stops, but, I mean, winter's miserable for everybody, particularly these sorts of winters, which are very cold and can be very brutal. But it's easier to be on the defensive than on the offensive in a winter because you've just got to stay put in wherever you are. Whereas if you're on the offensive, you've got to keep moving around, your vehicles have got to keep moving and they've got to keep completely properly maintained and so on. So it's harder to run an offensive during the winter. Although the hard ground is good for tanks and armoured vehicles, they don't sink into the mud, which is what is happening at the moment because this is the rainy season now in Ukraine. On balance, it's better to be defending than attacking during the winter. And so the Russians are playing for winter, they're digging in, and then next year, with this mobilisation, they're going to come back with a big second offensive the other side of the winter. OK,
well, a follow-on question here from Dave Langdon about the situation you mentioned there about digging in. Dave asked this: are we likely to see a siege situation like the Battle of Stalingrad this winter? And if so, is it possible that Russian troops might suffer from starvation? You talk about digging in, but you can get surrounded somewhere like Kherson or something like that.
Yes, I mean, that's plausible. I mean, nothing is as bad as Stalingrad. I mean, that was the greatest, most brutal battle of the 20th century, I think, certainly of the Second World War. And I doubt if it would be like that. And the Russians can always get food through. I mean, when we talk about Russians suffering from starvation, they're already suffering from pretty poor food and not much of it, because Russian logistics are so bad. But yes, a series of sieges where the Russians are holding against a Ukrainian offensive that's going more slowly during the winter, I would foresee that happening because the Ukrainians have really got their tails up now. They've prepared these two offensives, one towards the Donbass in Luhansk now, and the other one in the Kherson region. They worked on them for a long time. They planned them with the Americans and the Brits very carefully. They war gamed them out. And they're pursuing them really very cleverly. Now, they may not go as quickly in the future as they've gone in the last month or two, but I suspect that the Russians will be glad to see the other side of the winter when they've got more troops who will then be better trained, starting to arrive at the battlefront.
You mentioned more troops there, that partial mobilisation. Well, we've got a question from Jackie, which touches on the potential that there might be even more. Jackie asking what implications is there likely to be now that Belarus has teamed up with Russia? Well, of course, it's always teamed up with Russia.
Yes.
Is it inevitable we are heading for World War III? But could there be more troops than Belarusian forces coming from the north?
No, Jackie, don't worry about that. I mean, Belarus is a very small country. It's a big country territorially, but it's less than 10 million people. Its armed forces are an unknown quantity, but they're very weak. They're about 30,000. And most analysts would say they can't really put more than about 15,000 troops into the field because most of them are not actually active military most of the time, even though they're on the books. And if the Belarusians had to do something really quick, like by the end of next week, they could not produce more than 6,000 or 7,000 troops. So they're a very small force. The Russians are putting with them, it seems, some of their understrength units that have been withdrawn from the battle, and some from the 20th Combined Arms Army are going for joint exercises with the Belarusians. Now, joint exercises mean whatever you want it to mean, but I think that the chance of a serious new force being formed in Belarus is not great. What they're trying to do by talking about these joint operations and joint exercises is worry the Ukrainians into thinking that they might be able to open a third front up on the northwest of Ukraine to distract Ukrainian offensives down towards the south of the country, in the Donbass around Kherson. At the moment, the Ukrainians keep just reserve forces screening the Belarusian border. If they had to keep some of their better forces there, their more ready forces, that would be a nuisance. I mean, that would complicate their life, but I don't think they worry too much about it. And the Ukrainians are very clear-eyed about this. They're watching very carefully, and they're not terribly bothered at the moment by everything that's been said.
OK, let's get to, I touched on it earlier, the situation in Russia itself. I'm going to ask two questions because they're kind of linked at the same time to you. This initially from Mark saying, what is Putin's way out of this war without him losing face? It has to end somehow. Carl then asking the question, one way it might end. Do you think a coup against Putin is a realistic possibility? Well, it's hard to judge, isn't it, the impact of, the resistance we've seen within Russia, particularly to this conscription that's taking place.
I mean, I would say, nobody knows what's going to happen. But a coup is an entirely realistic possibility at some point, but we just don't know when. Because I've always argued, I mean, when you and I have been talking in previous weeks, that Putin is finished. But how long it will take for him to finish, whether he will go in a matter of months in a sudden reversal of fortune within the Kremlin, or whether it'll be 2 or 3 years. But he's taking Russia nowhere in this crisis, and things are getting worse. Now, interestingly, this week, American intelligence reported that they knew who it was in the Kremlin who is now opposing Putin. And that intelligence report was given to the president. And we don't know what the name is. The Washington Post reported it faithfully as an American intelligence report, really serious report. And President Biden was told who it is in the Kremlin who is seriously opposing Putin. Now, we can guess, but we'd all be sort of casting around. But, I mean, the people who matter in the Kremlin is Patrushev, he's worse than Putin in terms of his views. He's the chairman of the National Security Council. And Kirienko, who's his deputy chief of staff, his personal chief of staff. Lavrov, he's very powerful. Somewhere, if there is opposition, it's likely to come from the military and the security service.
So it's even more hardliners.
Right? More hardliners, yeah. He's being assailed by people who don't like the war, who are unhappy about it, and people who actually think he's too soft on the war. And so it's possible that he'll be removed by people who want to fight this war differently. So, Putin being removed is not necessarily going to end this war at all. It may actually take it into a new phase, and we've just got to face that possibility. But yes, a coup is entirely plausible.
Well, let's talk about this phase that we seem to move into yesterday with Russia firing those missiles deep into Ukraine and at civilian targets as well. And Gary asks this, why is Russia able to fire long-range missiles into Ukraine, but Ukraine cannot return long-range missiles? Presumably he means into parts of Russia. That's a decision taken by Ukraine, presumably?
There's two reasons. One is that the Ukrainians don't have them, long-range missiles, or long enough range, and the Russians do. And secondly, even if they do have them or do get them, and I think they do, I think they do have some, and that's a different story, but the Americans won't either confirm or deny that the Ukrainians may have these ATACMS missiles, which is this army tactical missile itself, which is very long range, very good warhead, longer range that you can use them on a multiple launch rocket system. Usually the MLRS systems will take either 6 or 12 smaller rockets with a range of 50 or 60 miles. The ATACMS have got a range of 180 miles and they'll carry a 500-pound warhead. So those are pretty big things. When you look at what the Ukrainians have achieved in Crimea, the suspicion is that they've got some. And they may have got them via the from the US, via Poland or Romania or even Turkey, who have been supplied with these things. We don't know. That's just a speculation. But in general, the Ukrainians don't have long-range missiles. And if they did have them, they almost certainly won't target Russian territory directly, because it's very important that this conflict is not seen as an attack on Russia. This whole war is about liberating Ukraine from unprovoked aggression. It's not about attacking Russia. It's a bit like, you think of the Gulf War in 1991, the famous Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. It was all about liberating Kuwait. A lot of people said, oh, carry on to Baghdad. You know, carry on. We've completely, you know, we've whipped the Iraqis. No, carry on. And President Bush Sr. said, no, this was only ever about liberating Kuwait. We are not going to try and bring down Saddam Hussein. That's what he said in 1991. Same thing here. If the Ukrainians started to attack Russian territory directly, obviously, then it would diminish the support we feel, because then it would be interpreted in Russia as it really is an attack on Russian homeland, and it isn't.
Let's talk about NATO now. This one from Harry. I'm going to ask the second one also about NATO from Andy as well. So let's look at both these questions. Harry's first. At what point would NATO get directly involved in the conflict? And Andy then posing a potential scenario, I suppose. What would be the consequence, if any, of Russia's missiles landing in NATO territory, even by accident? Well, we know NATO is deeply involved in this conflict in terms of weaponry, training, logistics,
everything,
but not actually boots on the ground.
And that's one of the red lines which both sides have respected and understand, that NATO troops and Russian troops or forces should not come into direct contact. And the Russians seem to know that very clearly, and we know it very clearly. But short of that red line, we're all moving towards it. And in reality, of course, NATO keeps crossing thresholds. We keep supplying Ukraine with more potent weaponry, because as this conflict goes on, as the Russians get more outrageous and as the war crimes build up day after day after day, you know, shelling of civilian areas, so the reluctance of NATO members and governments in NATO to supply potent weapons kind of evaporates. And so, as you and I have spoken about it previously, I think NATO is crossing thresholds all the time in terms of what it's going to...
What about if Russia attacked some, let's say, an arms depot or a training centre in a NATO country?
If it was deliberate, there would be a response, for sure, because NATO has said, Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary-General, has said, he's been backed up by Biden, to say not an inch. Every inch of NATO territory is sacred to NATO. If it was an accident, I suspect we'd make a big fuss and we'd protest. But if we suspected it wasn't an accident, there would be a response. I'm sure about that.
My goodness me. David asked this. Do you think this is perhaps along the lines of a question we've already had, but do you think that Ukraine may start tit-for-tat strikes against civilian targets in Russia? And I know I was talking yesterday to a former Prime Minister who suggested that perhaps Ukraine should try that. And, you know, this is the way that some Third World Wars start, presumably.
It is, and I think it would be, you know, for the reasons that we've already mentioned, it would be self-defeating for Ukraine to do that, because, you know, attacking civilian targets just confirms the civilian population in hatred for who is attacking them. Civilian morale does not break by civilian targets being attacked. I mean, it was the case in the Second World War. It was the case in other wars around the world. If you attack civilian targets, the civilians don't crack, they get more determined, generally speaking. And it would destroy Ukraine's very good moral position. I mean, everybody wants to help Ukraine. Everybody respects their position. Everybody in the West respects their position. That will be undermined if they seem deliberately to attack civilian targets. Because the Western way of warfare is that we do not, I promise you, we do not deliberately attack civilian targets. Civilians sometimes get killed and injured by Western action. But again, I can promise you it is never, ever deliberate. It is always some combination of accidents or misunderstandings or whatever it might be. The Russians do attack civilian targets directly, always have done, because that is part of their war doctrine. The Ukrainians are adopting Western ways of warfare, and they've got to stick to that one. That's a really important principle of Western warfare.
Well, let's talk more about the escalation that we're seeing and how far it might go. Niall McCabe asks this, do Russian ground forces have the capability to conduct warfare in a nuclear environment? Interesting question, this, in the event that Putin uses a tactical nuclear weapon. So, yeah, I mean, how do you use, what is a tactical nuclear weapon? Yeah. What effect does it have? And can your own forces remain immune from the fallout?
Well, no, they can't. So if nuclear weapons are used on the battlefield, and a tactical nuclear weapon, it's nothing to do with the size of the weapon as such, it's to do with how it is used. So a tactical nuclear weapon is for use on the battlefield. And of course, they used to say in Germany, in the Cold War, a tactical nuclear war in Germany would just be the same as a strategic nuclear strike. You know, if we ended up in a nuclear exchange with Russia, it wouldn't matter who won or lost. It would feel as if we'd all lost, because of the concentration of people in an area that would have been affected. Now, Ukraine's different because it's a physically big country. And if the Russians were ever to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, one of them would make no difference whatsoever. They would have to use a number of tactical nuclear weapons to make any battlefield difference. And those weapons would have to be getting on for Hiroshima-sized weapons. Right? So Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. And Nagasaki about the same, 15, 16 kilotons. If the Russians wanted to neutralise, i.e. kill, say, 3,000 Ukrainian troops who were foolish enough all to congregate in a place they'd taken, like Crimea, if they take Crimea and then they all hang around there, then the Russians would need to drop something like a 10-kiloton airburst that would probably kill 3,000 and maybe injure another 6,000 or 7,000. So you'd actually neutralise, say, 10,000 civilians and military in that case. And that would have dealt with Crimea, one place in the battle at the moment for Luhansk. Realistically, the Russians would have to use a handful, half a dozen, Hiroshima-sized bombs or something close to Hiroshima-sized bombs to have any military effect. And if Putin's going to cross that threshold, well, then he'll be subject to what I call the everlasting judgment of history.
Well, there's an obvious question which I'm sure all our viewers are wondering. Let's let Lindos put it. What would the West's likely reaction be to a nuclear strike by Russia? We've heard from General Petraeus, haven't we, formerly head of the CIA, that there would be a conventional response. He says that all the targets that they could see in Ukraine would be taken out, mainly by the United States.
Yeah, that's what he says. And whether General Petraeus is speaking, as it were, on behalf of the Pentagon, because he is very well connected. He's one of the best strategic thinkers in the United States, still in retirement. I don't know if that's the official American view, but it's entirely plausible. And what we understand, when the tactical nuclear weapon threat sort of raised its head again a couple of weeks ago, the United States and some NATO members, and I'm sure we were one of them, but 3 or 4 NATO members personally contacted their counterparts in Russia and in the Russian General Staff to say, don't even think about it. Because, and what they seem to have been saying, they won't tell us what they said, nor should they, because there's got to be some uncertainty about this in order to maintain a sense of deterrence. But what they seem to have said is, first of all, we will not be passive. We won't just condemn you. We will do a lot about it. Secondly, we will not go nuclear, but we'll sure as heck go conventional. And we have the conventional power to hit all of your nuclear infrastructure and facilities. And interestingly, if we even think that you're going nuclear, if we see the preparation starting, remember there's a long firing chain in Russia for tactical nuclear weapons. They've got to do quite a lot to get missiles and warheads together in a place where they can use them, or aircraft flying from Russia that can drop something. If we even see you making these preparations, we might attack you. That seems to have been the message. Now, I don't know if that's...
Conventionally or with nuclear?
Conventionally. Now, I don't know if that's what they said, but there's a general belief that that's what they said, and that the NATO is making it clear that you will cross a big line, if not just a moral line, but you'll cross a line where we will take you on as a military power by conventional means. And if you can live with the risks of that and the certainty that you will lose a great deal of your military infrastructure in our response, then go ahead.
We are getting close. What's the 60th anniversary, isn't it, of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
End of this month. The 26th, 27th and 28th of the month.
I say that because Suzanne
Yeah.
has got this question. Let's do some comparisons with history. Is this war similar to any other conflicts over the last 50 to 100 years? If it is, how did that previous conflict end? And could it provide lessons on how to end this one? What can you tell us, Michael? What can history tell us?
Well, all conflicts are different, of course. I mean, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I mean, this is like the conflicts of the 20th century, the conflicts against the fascist powers. I mean, Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 on spurious historical grounds because they wanted to take Manchurian territory. They thought it belonged to them. And then they extended it to the whole of China in 1936. And while that was happening, Germany, united with Austria in the Anschluss in 1936, then took the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia in 1938, then the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939, then invaded Poland in the end of 1939. And not to be outdone, Italy invaded Abyssinia in 1935 to recreate some sort of Roman Empire, and then invaded Albania in 1939, all on spurious sort of genetic historical grounds. And so that's why when we talk about Putin looking like Hitler, it's always dangerous to bring Hitler into arguments about this. But to be honest, in this case, the parallels are quite creepy. They're quite striking. And I mean, this is a 21st century war of 20th century imperialism. This is a power that has decided it wants to conquer territories outside of its legal recognised borders for spurious historical reasons, with a crazy, misunderstood version of their own history, the history of Russia, the history of the Slavs. 21st century weapons. And
indeed. Of course, you mentioned, we were talking there earlier, weren't we, about a potential response from NATO should tactical nuclear weapons be used by Russia. What happens, though, if we haven't got enough? Norman poses this question. Are Western countries not in danger now of supplying so much of their weapons stockpile that they'll be left needing supplies themselves? Are we beginning to run out? We're hearing about production difficulties.
Already. The fact is, we've given Ukraine a lot of our stocks. We gave them all of our NLAWs, the anti-tank weapon that made a big difference in the Battle of Kiev back in February, March. We gave them everything we had, and we're trying to restock now. And, I mean, the suppliers, people like Saab in the case of the NLAWs, they've not been used to supplying big numbers, even in the States. I mean, Northrop and Boeing, they've been used to supplying numbers of 10s and 20s every year of these things as replacements, and as some go off the end of the sell-by dates, as it were. Now they're asking for hundreds of these things, and so Western defence industries cannot cope, and we're into this very interesting and difficult situation where we want to give Ukrainians everything that they need in high numbers. And we are depleting our own stocks. There's big arguments going on in Germany about whether they should leave themselves with nothing to give Ukraine material. And there's a bit of politics behind that argument as well. We're more gung-ho about it. We say, look, give them everything and we will find ways of restocking. But it isn't just a question of finding the money for the stocks. The manufacturers now are doing very small amounts of most things. And so this is the tip of an iceberg. And the rest of the iceberg is that this is the return of industrial warfare to Europe. Right? This is we've seen warfare, the last 30 or 40 years, is warfare of fragmentation, small wars, wars of choice, wars we didn't really have to go to unless we thought there was something important about it. This is the return of industrial war. Whoever prevails in this war, ultimately, will be the side that can deploy its industrial capacity properly. Now, the Russians are trying to do that. The Ukrainians need us to do it on their behalf. And we're only half realising that at the moment.
Well, let's end this discussion with the big geopolitical question and indeed back to that question about how it all might end. This from Adam. Will China and India bring an end to the war by condemning Russia? Or is there a view in places like China and India that let the West slug it out with Russia and exhaust themselves and we can pick up the global pieces?
The view in China was not so much let them exhaust themselves, but let the Russians diminish NATO further. Let them prove how hopeless the Americans are. Let them show that the West Europeans are not a power or not a group of powers to be reckoned with. That seemed to be the Chinese view. Of course, it's gone wrong because the West has stood up to this war much more so than anybody thought the West would, including most of us. And that's partly because President Zelensky went out on the streets of Kiev on the day the war started and said, I've not gone, I'm here, we're all here. And the fact that he was prepared to fight and put his own life on the line a lot of time, that first week he was nearly killed a few times. And that fact changed the nature of the war. That Zelensky said, I'm here, and Biden said, OK, we will support you, we'll supply you. And that's created the war that we've got. And in that respect, it's gone very, very wrong for Xi Jinping of China. So can he bring it into law? Yes, he can. If he withdrew support, and he himself doesn't want to withdraw support because he's a friend of Putin.
Well, we saw at that summit, didn't we?
That's right.
Last month, when both India and China seemed to be slightly critical of Putin.
The Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Xi Jinping of China was obviously critical. Modi said we can't carry on with this war. Erdogan of Turkey said you've got to look for peace. And even the minor players, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, they humiliated Putin. They actually kept him waiting. Nobody would have dared to do that a year ago, but they all kept him waiting because you can see this man's power, his political power, is draining away. If Xi Jinping pulls the plug on him, then I think that he's got absolutely nowhere else to go. And I think then he would fall. Then he would be removed because that would be a complete disaster for Russia. I don't know that Xi Jinping is going to pull the plug on him, but Xi has got his 20th Party Congress this month, and we'll see how he emerges from that. He won't do anything until that's over, but when he's got his third term, we'll see what he does early next year.
Michael, I'm sorry I've got to pull the plug on you. Fascinating conversation as ever.